Hi, welcome to Athbheochan. I'm Blue Niall, a musician, artist and designer from Dublin. In recent years, I've found myself increasingly drawn to exploring, through my work, Irishness and aspects of Irish identity. I started sampling traditional music, writing lyrics in Irish and linking with like-minded people through collaborations. I started to notice that I wasn't alone. In the cultural fields of Ireland, something very interesting is happening. Athbheochan, or Rebirth, is a radio show about a new Celtic revival, looking at the explosion of new Irish art forms, utilising Irish accents, Irish language, samples of Irish music and colloquialisms, along with the renewal of interest in Celtic and pre-Celtic cultures and practices and aesthetics in Ireland and beyond. The show features music and conversation, and each episode will focus on a theme. I wanted to speak to a forward-thinking, young Irish generation that's fed up with certain aspects of the country and its culture, but immensely proud of other aspects. People who don't speak Irish but would like to learn, who are interested in Celtic mythology, and also love global music such as hip-hop and underground club music. SPF TV are running a series of 6 episodes of Athbheochan to celebrate St. Patrick's Festival. This episode is called Boss. It features an interview with Tanya, a death doula, who started the social enterprise Keepstones, talking about how we handle death in this country and what we can learn from bringing back older practices such as keening to help us learn from the wisdom of death. There's also a mix from Peter Donnell and Also Studio, inspired by the concept of Boss. If you like what you hear, please follow me at blue_Niall_ on Instagram, or drop me an email at blueniallblue@gmail.com and subscribe to the mailing list via the link below. You can also keep in touch with my guests. I've dropped all their social profiles below and would highly recommend following these interesting, creative people who I believe are going to shape the future of the country. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Gurmila Mahagat, Agus Tanya, I'm so happy and excited to have you on to Athbheochan today. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the really interesting thing that you do. But before I dive into that, I just want to ask you, for people who don't know, what is a death doula?
Okay, well, it's great to be here. There's something kind of archetypal about a doula, but the term itself would have not been common probably until the 60s. So essentially it is a Greek term, and it means woman servant, or being, in service, but it usually has the connotation of, the character being a female. And I guess there was, around the 60s, a role started to emerge in society where women primarily felt that they needed to be assisted in birth, birthing, something like a midwife, if you like. So there's birth doulas. And I suppose the difference between a birth doula and a midwife would be that a birth doula is really there as an emotional support. So less about the medical and more about the advocating and guiding and being present, being the witness, if you like. And also being usually quite close to or acknowledging the sacredness of the fact that a spirit, if you like, is coming into form. So, okay, you don't have to have a spiritual belief system per se to be a birth doula, but there would tend to be a correlation. And so a death doula is something similar, but on the other end of the life spectrum. So if you like, there are patterns coming up to birth that we can witness that would be quite familiar and that would tend to inform us about the type of birth that's going to, happen. And also that would then inform us around how to support the woman who's about to give birth. And similarly, there would be patterns leading up to death, and that a death doula would begin to map, if you like, and would be informed by the same manifestations, if you like. But it's just that rather than a being coming into form, you have a being leaving form. And so, we spend a lot of time acknowledging birth and being very excited about it in society and preparing for it. and talking about it a lot, and celebrating it, but we don't do the same for death. And I guess death doulas are a phenomenon that is bringing the wisdom back to that part of the life spectrum. Yeah, does that make it a little clearer, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, that's just so interesting, and I'm really keen to ask a little bit more about the kind of the patterns and the wisdom. But before that, I'd love to just invite you to introduce yourself and how did you get into this kind of really interesting career / vocation of being a death doula?
So I'm Tanya, and I'm 52 years of age, and I qualified in 2012 as a humanistic integrative psychotherapist. And currently I would consider myself now to be an apprenticed doula. So I don't feel like I'm fully fledged. I feel like I'm still embodying the role because I have a lot to learn, and also because I have engaged more with the companionship aspect of the doula work and helping people prepare, if you like, rather than being in that more psychopomp role, which would be another term that we would use for a doula who's there at the very end phase, say the last breath, if you like. So I'm waiting for life to present that experience to me naturally, and not to go rushing after it. And so far that hasn't presented, even within the context of my own life, where we would have, or I have met doulas, say death doulas, who are within the community of whom I'm a member, if you like, who have had lots of experience with death per se, as in being with somebody who's really in that actively dying phase. So to come back, full, I just wanted to be really authentic about that, because it's important to me, that I don't try and present as somebody who has an identity as such that doesn't fully reflect my life experience so far. So I like to think of myself as being in preparation for that, and I feel that it will naturally occur in time. And definitely, there's a lot of learning to be had in the companionship aspect that I'm in. And I would have suffered in my 20s and kind of my early adulthood from, depression and compulsions, if you like, and acting out a bit, maybe just not really understanding what life was about. I think things happened, which is, just, there's no need to go into the finite details of my story, but things happened that caused me trauma. And I think I spent an awful lot of time being confused, in a state of confusion and, say, self-soothing, like most of the planet does, using external things to maybe resist against the feelings of those things that had happened, rather than kind of going in to heal them, because there wasn't maybe that kind of language wasn't available, say, in the environment that I was growing up in. And that would have come to a point where I sort of imploded, say, in my mid-30s, where the body just took over, I think, and it just, it had its own wisdom, and it said, no, time to stop here. We're going to slow you down. So there was a crisis, if you like. And so the chaos became unmanageable, and the overwhelm would have brought me to a phase of having to get therapy or to seek support, external, support. And that was the beginning of me understanding how to map my own feelings, and then also starting to understand the nature of trauma And it was around that time when I had that really sort of peak state of chaos that I experienced my first non-ordinary state, where I would say, there was something mystical happened, which is very hard for me to address in language, actually. But I felt as if I had been given a reprieve, like a moment, or it lasted for half a day. It was like the deepest sense of ease that I have since experienced a handful of times, but a sense of peace that I had never experienced in my life to that point. So that I would see now as a threshold, as a hinge point. And it was actually the next day that I went and sought support through the psychotherapeutic realm, and began to address, as I said, my traumas. And then I think I naively felt then at a certain point that I was fully healed, and that I would train to be a psychotherapist, and that I would give back to the world, and that's the point where I started to operate in a way as I took on a role, if you like, and I was wearing a hat of, the psychotherapeutic hat. And then I think, again, back to naivety, I worked in frontline services. And I tended to pick roles that were really tricky, like in homeless shelters, domestic violence refuge, methadone clinics, get down there into the shadow aspect of society, and really, kind of in an archetypal way. I think I was sort of in activist mode, trying to do something, give back and do something really radical. But that, in fact, would have been the arena in which I saw the most, where I came into contact with a lot of suffering, and would have witnessed, my first, would have had experience of, or witnessed people dying, of overdoses, suicide, and all, just really learning the very important aspect of having clear boundaries, within the client work. And I think that over time, I worked maybe 10 years in those arenas. I came to a point where I felt that I really needed to take rest, and absorb everything that had happened, because I went from sort of being in a state of woundedness to going then directly to work with the wounded, and there wasn't a gap in between. And, I hadn't slowed down enough. And I think I kind of reached a second point of crisis where the body just said no. And I came out of all roles, including, the psychotherapeutic roles that I would, because I would have been in private practice as well. I put my license on hold, and I went into a state of deep reflection, and I started to grieve during that period of time. And I think in retrospect, I was releasing a lot of stories, the story of me and the story of suffering. And I guess it was at that stage that I realized that I was still carrying a lot of the trauma in my cells, because I think I had come to a point of, moving out of regret, or I wasn't holding on to, say, any of the things that would have happened to me when I was younger, but the body was still remembering, and I started to then practice somatic therapies and release the memories, or the held on to story from my system, from my body. So I started using recalibration tools like the art form of lament, which was, yeah, I mean, it's a story in itself, if you like, but it became a faithful companion to me, where I started putting sound alongside or to accompany the grief, and that then naturally opened up a trajectory of meeting a whole constellation of people that were actually involved in restoring the art form of keening in Ireland. And it was actually there, you know, within the context of those workshops, because I'd started my little company, A Time to Gather, and I started putting together projects with, you know, the concept being, you know, that I was going to present workshops with deep and meaningful themes that would address grief in a new way. And yeah, there I actually met my first death doula. And so I started to, I guess, recognize also that in order for me to, well, reclaim what I had lost, you know, because it was years of depression and feeling uncomfortable and really high anxiety and socially anxious as well, you know, that there was like a deep need to acknowledge that time, you know, and to mark it, if you like, and to release it and to move on in a way in order to embrace life more fully. But I think, you know, in order for us to embrace our life, in order for us to be really richly committed to living, we really need to understand the wisdom of dying as well. And they seemed, for me, it just seemed logical for me to start to dip into the deeper wisdom of death being a teacher.
It's an amazing story, Tanya. There's so many things that just really captured me in that, and I'd love to ask you about that wisdom and about, I think, you know, there was a few themes in what you said. One thing I heard a lot was kind of slowing down. Another thing was, you know, you talked about the shadow, things that we're trying to not to think about, and maybe we're doing that self-soothing, and then, you know, but sometimes we need to really slow down and spend time with those things. But today we obviously live in a society where there's such an inclination to rush, and, you know, time is money, and it's overstimulation, oversaturation, you know, and then you talked about the beautiful kind of return of the keening, and, you know, this show is called Athbheochan, and it's very much about that bringing back of those older traditions and rediscovering some of that cultural wisdom that we have, you know, in this country, and also, you know, all over the world, but don't always listen to. Like, how do you see, when you look at, to take death as an example, you know, and it is a very extreme example, where that maybe one of the best places to look to understand like who we really are as a culture, and how we approach things. Like, what is the approach to death that you see in society in general? How does that maybe fall short, and what is that replaced by in this newer kind of constellation of approaches towards death that you are embracing and kind of bringing back?
Okay, yeah. There's not really much point in us being overly nostalgic and suggesting that, you know, our traditions of old, you know, had us completely sorted. I mean, there were the problems, and poverty was one, but that said, I think we were very much closer, you know, or we were closer to the seasons, and we were closer to nature, and we were closer to the dark. I think we really, like, well, you know, because, well, essentially we didn't even have electricity at one point, you know, where we would have really understood that there was a phase of going inward because we were naturally predisposed to that. And also, you know, dying wasn't a medical phenomenon up until maybe 100 years ago, and even less. So people knew the patterns of dying. They were very close to it. People were dying at home. And okay, we can't say that people were dying well as such, but I don't think that it was hidden away as it is now. And I think it was recognized as a rite of passage. And I think we also would have had beliefs and customs that would have served us in such a way as to, well, recognize it for, you know, as the threshold that it is. So, I mean, keening would have been one of those. And I guess now we see that we're very much orientated around relieving symptoms, you know? So I guess what I'm seeing is often not that people, especially, you know, lately, where people like the aged are often terrified of the idea of going into hospital because they, and rightly so, would feel that if they go in at a certain point that they may not come back out again, you know, because there's an over medicalized system with the focus of keeping people alive. And that can be past the point of, well, nature, really, you know. We live in a death phobic culture now, I think. And I guess there's a lot of distress for people when their bodies are pushed past the point of being able to sustain themselves, you know. And there's a maybe an overemphasis on, as I said, relieving pain rather than just, you know, recognizing that there's a relationship that we have with pain. And yes, it can be suffering, but also it's the resistance or our inability to let go to what is. And I guess we're chasing all the time longevity, you know. We don't want to do endings, you know. It's not our thing anymore in a way. And I guess like I'm quite shocked by the denial there is around death. So, you know, people, they even say they have, you know, language that would really emphasize the resistance, you know, kick the bucket or, you know, those kind of terms where I suppose rather than seeing that there is a wisdom in the dying. So I guess what I mean by that is that we're refusing to acknowledge it as an opportunity to teach the next generation something really important, you know? And so, I mean, that would then bring me into this point or wondering around what's elderhood, you know? And what can we imagine about a culture that is probably quite bereft of elders? I'm not sure if I'm answering.
You are, and I think that's
question.
such an interesting point. You know, I actually did a project a long time ago, well, a while ago now, that was about looking at the future of society in relation to aging populations, and it was for the Design Council in the UK, and they were looking at like with increasing amounts of older people in society, like how does the care system need to evolve. And I had the pleasure of going and speaking with a lot of different people around the UK, which is where it was based, who were at various stages of their aging kind of journey, aka their life, and asking them, how does it feel to get older? When do you consciously feel, is there a moment when you feel like I'm old, or do you know what I mean? Or what are there turning points in life? Like, and I learned a lot of really interesting things from people. I learned that, like, for example, people often experience their life as like speeding up. So one thing someone said was, by the time you're 25, you've lived like half your life, because the rest of it just passes in a flash or whatever. Or there was things like a mirror moment that certain people had when they saw themselves, and they felt like, that doesn't look like me, like that, I don't recognize myself anymore, and that kind of strange disembodiment. But one of the most interesting things was, I talked to an Indian man who was, in his 90s, and he was like, you would have thought that he was in his 50s to look at him. Like, he was so healthy. But it was really interesting, because I'd also seen people much younger, right, who hadn't weathered life as well. But it was interesting, because he was like, look, the key is yoga and diet, and that's what my medicine cabinet is my food cupboard. But anyway, the other big thing that we observed was, like, he lived with his family, right? And he was right in the center of that home. And yeah, I guess there is a sense sometimes of, obviously there's all kinds of different arrangements that suit people at different stages, and families have to make really difficult decisions for themselves. But, is there a thing of, where are we sending older people? Are we putting them, are we foregrounding them enough, and are we listening to them enough? And I think that things that are happening now, like, twilight careers and second act type careers, people taking their wisdom and working in a different way, maybe in a flexible way, there's so much wisdom there. And like the kind of chronic loneliness that we can see in older populations is just, kind of really sad. I've a friend who will be annoyed at me for saying that, though, because equally, we can't be stereotyping people that they're all lonely and whatever, and just because they're a certain age that they're in this mode. Like, definitely people aren't victims and have agency and stuff. But for someone who's in my generation and sitting in the point of the kind of life cycle that I'm at right now, like it definitely gave me pause and made me reflect on a few things. So I totally hear what you're saying. And I want to ask you, the wisdom you're sharing, you're sharing it through your words now, but also recently you've been sharing it through workshops, and you're now sharing it through a social enterprise that you're setting up, Keepstone. And that was one of the things I was really keen to ask you about also. So it would be great if you could explain, how are you pulling together like the things you've learned on your journey, the observations you have, and of course being still learning as like an apprentice death doula, as you're saying, but having probably, certainly way more wisdom than me, and having reflected on this topic and spent the difficult time kind of face to face with it. Where have you ended up? What is Keepstone, and what will it be? And just explain a little bit about the idea and where you're at with it.
Okay, great. So I came across a phenomenon when I was doing my research project, which was part of the creative process of self-reflection for, embodying the role of doula, if you like. And I was moving around, like visiting various different services, different, the different characters that were in the industry, if you like, of the funeral industry, for example, or care of the dying. And yeah, I came across this phenomenon where I realized after a couple of conversations with independent funeral directors that they were suffering a few issues, but one that really intrigued me was that they did notice a change or a shift in the way that we're remembering our predecessors, the disconnect within communities. Maybe that's to do with emigration, or it's also to do with, I would imagine, really again back to trauma, but stories of addiction and families falling apart. But essentially it was this issue of ashes, as in cremated remains, not being collected, actually being left behind or forgotten. Or it could be that they, as in the crematorium or the funeral director, was left holding on to cremated remains because there was a dispute maybe between the family as to who would get it or who would get them, or that they were left holding on to the remains for an undefined amount of time. And I was seeing this a lot. So I found it quite shocking. And then I went looking at what was happening in the cremation storyline in other countries, because we've only been cremating for 40 years. So when you look at the States or England, that storyline is much longer. It's like 100, 150 years, say, in the States. Yeah. I realized that phenomenon exists everywhere. And in actual fact, there's a system called ForgottenAshes.com in the States where there's thousands of people listed, people that, basically cremated remains that were never sought after, never ritualistically laid to rest, if you like, left just on a dusty shelf. So, okay, that problem isn't huge here, but it is happening. And it did start me wondering about what's changing. How is it that we are perhaps not paying more attention, being more respectful of the life process, which would include, again, the elders, and then if they're passing, isn't something that we want to even pay attention enough to follow through on some kind of marking, if you like, by in whatever manner that presents. Then something's missing. I was like, what's the gap? What's happening here? And then I started to investigate that. And Keepstones is basically what I feel is it's a remembering tool. It's essentially, in a very practical level, it's a process where people intentionally change the ash, the cremated remains, into keepstones. So like a hold on to tangible memory stone. So it's a refiring process that alchemizes the ash. And one of the reasons behind that is environmental, because I got so fascinated by the process of cremation and what happens in it and what we end up with. I realized that people have a mixture of responses, actions and reactions. Some people really find it quite unseemly to have a plastic bag full of ash that once was their beloved. So how could we perhaps change that for them by literally changing the ashes and creating something new? And I actually realized that there is a company in the States doing something similar, but the difference here would be that I'm very much focused on wrapping ceremony and ritual around that, or basically accompanying people probably at a later stage of mourning into a process where they learn the skill of, a skill of grief, if you like, looking at grief as a skill. And then also that they come into a creative process around mapping out their own memorial, a memorial that will be fitting to them and their belief system. And I guess also what I understood when I started looking at cremation was, okay, people can be they're cremating for many reasons, and one can be cost related. You know, it is the cheaper route. When you look at the funeral industry, prices are extortionate. But it also can be loss of faith, or it can be that there's just no plot available, you know, or that they might want to fit into the family plot, like the family plot is full, because that's also something that's happening when you look at other countries, is that cemeteries are filling up. So when somebody goes down the route of cremation without being very informed about what's going to happen, it can be that they reach a point at the end where they receive an urn of ash, but that they realize that something has been missing, because although a lot of people are moving away from the church does present a container, if you like. It's a container for ritual to sit into. So there is a celebration, and okay, it's prayerful and there's dogma involved, but it does or can assist somebody to acknowledge the departure of the loved one. Whereas with cremation, it's not always the case. Okay, you have a celebrant, and if they're a good celebrant, they're going to do the job well, then it'll be something comparative. But it tends to be much quicker. You know, the window of time is really short. And certainly around the pandemic, thousands of families would have been pushed into or I suppose found themselves in a situation where policies made it so that the window of celebration, or the ceremony, well, the funeral, if you like, in itself, was no longer than 15 minutes. And so when I started to trace that, I realized that there are a lot of people currently living in Ireland who have not had the opportunity to acknowledge the death of their loved one in a way that has given them a sense of meaning, you know. So Keepstones, it has an environmental aspect to it, and it also has a well-being aspect. And the environmental would be education and teaching people that, you know, scattering of ashes is essentially not ideal. You know, the people don't understand that the process that's involved with cremation means that there can be a lot of chemicals, you know, if the body's been embalmed, and you'll have a coffin mixed up in the ashes, which could be like a coffin that's been treated in a particular way, you know. So the pH levels of cremated remains are actually something similar to bleach, so that it's not supportive of the environment. And so much so that in countries where cremation has become the sort of the prominent choice, that scattering has become illegal. We're, you know, at that stage where we're building the framework, and we're arriving at a point where we're going to be hopefully launching our pilot around maybe the end of the summer. We're trying to bring into focus the piece that seems to be missing in the psyche of Irish people at the moment around that funeral choice, you know.
I think you've been really clear, Tanya, and I'm
yay.
really excited. I think what I'm hearing is that, you know, with the increase in cremation, the decrease in the kind of classic, you know, Christian funerals, Catholic funerals that we've had, and that there's a risk that we kind of lose all of the things that make us slow down and actually process death, and lean into this kind of sped up, hyper modern grief process where it's 15 minutes in a crematorium and you're left holding this bag of ashes that you're not really sure what to do with, and actually seizing that opportunity to bring in some of the wisdom around death, you know, create a creative, open-ended process where people can learn from that process, and yeah, just, you know, because it is one of the biggest lessons that nature has to teach us is impermanence and passing, and, you know, and the pain and everything else that comes with that. So I think it's really beautiful what you're doing, and I want to ask if, for people who are listening and who are really keen to just like hear more, keep up with what you're doing, or, you know, become a part of it, where can people find you, and how can people stay in touch?
Yeah, great. So there is a website landing page up there, keepstones.ie, and they can send an inquiry email, or I can put them on the mailing list for the launch information. And on my other website is A Time to Gather, and that would be the main frame for all the other work that I do, which would be the mystical and the magical and the psychotherapeutic and the lament work on any of those pieces that I do. You know, I suppose I've got my finger in a few different pies in relation to like companionship, and then also supporting people into integrating near-death experiences. So that would be the mystical part. And then the lament work, you know, we from time to time are still putting together opportunities for groups or people to attend a recalibration for the body by jumping into an event where we use sound, and there'll be more of those. And we're hoping that we'll be able to use the art form of lament as one of the skill sets that we would be teaching people in them coming out of deeper mourning, you know. So because that's, I suppose, what I recognized was that people were stuck or you know, in a state of deep bereavement, and then using these different tools, including the actual stones in themselves, you know, the choice of metamorphosis, to mirror or reflect the movement out of mourning and into more cathartic grief. Because grief is essentially love, you know, where something is absent, you know, that there's no place to put the love into. So a relationship that has, you know, that has disappeared essentially. And yeah, so keepstones.ie or a time to gather.ie. And yeah, I hope to launch by the middle of the summer, support that will suit their needs. So there'll be grief psychotherapists, there'll be death doulas, you know, there'll be grief and lament facilitators. There'll be a mixture of skill sets within the content or within the service itself.
Amazing. Well, Tanya, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed the chat, and I know that the listeners will have as well. Just can't wait to see it growing. I think it's a part of a really needed and amazing shift around how we view death, and like you said, the wisdom we can learn from it. And I think that point on grief is just really beautiful, that it's love that doesn't have a place to go anymore. That'll really stay with me. So
thanks, Niall. I really appreciate being invited, and yeah, lots of love.
I just lay low, I can't lay back. All my anxious voices, it was way back. And I lost my youth, I wanna way back. And the walls to be, I wanna break that. All the fakeness, I don't play that. Hate the ways that they chat, try to pull me on the same track. No way lad, let the Colleen, she a Cahavs, Nila Sagum, Fuin Godrev, Chame Glita, Imachola, Kubla Mila, Solar Stop me, Nama Kinta, August Tosa, Lanadina, Toshi Lofa, B McDowsa, Glocka Shota, Kubla Bangers, Saxa Pota, B McDowsa, Egg and Flat, Chrissy Cash, Terme Shah, Aaron August.